A war appeared imminent. A first strike might take place at any time. I said to myself, if Cuba is in such an unfortunate war, we will disappear from the map.
Robert Kennedy came to me and said, Mr. Ambassador, the situation is very tense. Your missiles have just shot down our plane. Our generals demand that we retaliate. If we start bombing, you will fight back. What can we do?
It was a perfectly beautiful night, as full nights are in Washington. I walked out of the President's Oval Office, and as I walked out, I thought I might never live to see another Saturday night.
Throughout the 1940s and 50s, the Caribbean island of Cuba had been America's playground. Beaches, booze, and casinos. Havana had it all. Cuba's land and industry were owned almost entirely by American corporations.
We consider part of the United States practically just a wonderful little country over there that was of no danger to anybody. As a matter of fact, was a rather important economic asset to the United States.
Cuba's leader, Fulgencio Batista, was a brutal dictator. His people were turning against him. After years of guerrilla fighting in the mountains, a charismatic 33-year-old lawyer, Fidel Castro, entered Havana on the 8th of January 1959.
The triumph of the revolution was an example of order. There was no looting. No one was dragged along the streets. There were no murders, no crimes. There was perfect order.
In this perfect order, over 500 members of the former regime were accused of crimes against the people, tried and executed. Fearing the rise of a new dictator, thousands fled to exile in the United States. But to most people, Castro was a hero.
The revolution promised to provide jobs for the people. It promised honesty in the administration, which had never existed in Cuba. There were health programs which had never existed before. Education programs which had never existed before.
Most important of all, Castro nationalized millions of acres of land held by American companies and gave it to the people. Eager to tell the world of his revolution, Castro flew to New York to speak at the United Nations. President Eisenhower was too busy to see him. But Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, was delighted to embrace a new revolutionary and offered him economic assistance.
Cuba
decided to buy oil from the Soviet Union, which would be cheaper. The country could also get credit from the Soviet Union, who were willing to help us. But the American companies refused to refine the oil.
With nowhere to refine the Soviet oil, Castro was faced with economic disaster. He sent in his militia and took over the foreign refineries in Cuba. America's retaliation was swift.
At his White House press conference, President Eisenhower announces that Cuba's assigned share of the United States sugar market has been cut by 95% in reply to what I call Fidel Castro's deliberate policy of hostility.
As tension mounted, Castro nationalized a further $1 billion worth of American investments. An irate President Eisenhower declared a complete trade embargo and ordered the CIA to recruit Cuban exiles. They would be trained to destroy Castro's regime.
Government agencies of the United States began training people to bomb Cuba and to burn the sugarcane fields. They used small planes with incendiary devices to set fire to the fields. It was very serious. This was the only wealth we had.
They carried out a dirty war against our country. Guerrilla units were active in every province, even in Havana.
Over 100 people died when La Cubra, a freighter unloading arms and ammunition from Belgium, exploded in Havana harbor. CIA sabotage was suspected, but never proved. Castro turned to the Soviet Union for help.
Perhaps he might have taken a different line had the Americans been more mild towards him than they actually were. The Cold War was in its full bloom, so whatever was unpleasant to the Americans was welcomed in this country, and vice versa, I would say.
At a secret base in the Guatemalan jungle, American CIA agents had been training Cuban exiles to invade Cuba. This, they thought, would be the impetus for the Cuban people to rise up and overthrow Castro. The plan was presented to the new president, John F. Kennedy.
Kennedy felt that a plan that he had inherited, under which a band of Cuban exiles were to liberate their own country, was one he could hardly turn his back on. Surely the United States should help get rid of a communist dictatorship in our hemisphere.
The CIA badly misled the new president, promising him an easy victory and an end to the Cuban problem. Kennedy agreed to the invasion, but demanded crucial changes to hide America's involvement. Just 3 days before the planned invasion, Kennedy denied any possibility of American intervention.
There will not be, under any conditions, be an intervention in Cuba by United States Armed Forces. And this government will do everything it possibly can, and I think it can meet its responsibilities to make sure that there are no Americans involved in any actions inside Cuba.
As Kennedy spoke, the invasion force was gathering. An advance wave of American bombers planned to destroy Castro's air force on the ground. The president, worried that this might reveal Washington's role, ordered the operation scaled down. On April the 15th, 1961, just 6 American bombers, disguised in the colors of the Cuban Air Force, took off from Nicaragua for a crucial attack on Cuban airfields. But with so few bombers, only 3 Cuban planes were destroyed. 7 civilians were killed. As they buried those who had died, Castro, seeking Soviet support, finally declared that the revolution was socialist.
Porque lo que no pueden perdonarnos los imperialistas es que estemos aquí y que hayamos hecho una revolución socialista en las propias narices de los Estados Unidos.
Continuamos preparando. Resistir nada. We prepared ourselves to resist an invasion against all the forces we knew the Americans had at their disposal.
The following day, just 1,500 exiles, equipped with American arms and ammunition, arrived at the Bay of Pigs, 125 miles to the south of Havana.
Éramos los hombres más felices del mundo. We were the happiest men in the world because we had the opportunity to return to Cuba, our homeland, to fight to rescue freedom and democracy so that our country could be for all Cubans.
American planes were to protect the invasion force as they hit the beach. But Kennedy, now faced with international condemnation for the initial bombing, cancelled the air support. Castro's remaining air force quickly destroyed the ships carrying vital ammunition supplies. Mistakenly believing that this was a full-scale American invasion, Cuba mobilized all its forces.
The worst moments were at the beginning. We didn't have much information about the enemy. We didn't know if they were 1,000, 3,000 or 10,000. We didn't know what types of weapons they might have. We didn't know if this was a total invasion.
Without American air support or resupply, the invasion force was outnumbered and outgunned. Within 72 hours, the invaders were either captured or dead.
I did not realize that the mission was impossible until the last day, almost at the end. We trusted in our allies. We never thought they would forsake us or abandon us. We didn't think that they could betray the commitment they had with us.
Jack Kennedy was devastated by the fiasco at the Bay of Pigs, and he said it was a fiasco. He was not accustomed to failure in politics or in life. And he was more distraught than I'd ever seen him. How could I have been so stupid, he said.
Castro had survived and humiliated Kennedy. The CIA was told to think again.
Our job was to start to come up with new plans, not a Bay of Pigs type plans, but new plans to, quote, get rid of Castro and the Castro regime, unquote.
Everything was suggested, from assassination to spraying LSD into a television studio to make it seem as if Fidel had gone mad. Whatever they tried, Castro took in his stride. More secure within his own country, he sought to export revolution to the rest of Latin America. Alarmed by this prospect, America kept up the pressure on Castro. In the spring of 1962, a practice invasion of a Caribbean island was mounted by 40,000 American Marines.
We did that purposely to make Castro pay more attention to that than causing trouble in Latin and Central America. But the Cubans and the Russians, they told us later, believed that the United States really did intend to attack Cuba, and therefore Castro kept saying, I need some help.
Castro's pleas inspired the Soviet leader Khrushchev to make a daring offer. He had boasted to the world of Russia's nuclear strength, but in reality, he knew just how limited his long-range missile force really was. But he did have medium-range nuclear missiles.
From the territory of the Soviet Union, they couldn't possibly reach the territory of the USA. But deployed on Cuba, they would become strategic nuclear weapons. That meant, in practical terms, we had a chance to narrow the differences between our forces.
I immediately appreciated the strategic importance of the presence of those missiles in Cuba. By that time, the Americans had already transported similar missiles to Turkey. I thought, if we expected the Soviets to fight on our behalf, to run risks for us, and even involve themselves in a war for our sake, it would be immoral and cowardly on our part to refuse to accept the presence of those missiles here.
In July 1962, under the nose of the Americans, the first of 150 Soviet ships, loaded with heavily disguised nuclear missiles and over 40,000 troops, sailed for Cuba.
The Americans just didn't notice that we managed to deliver not one, but 43,000 people there, plus the equipment, weapons, and everything necessary for the installation work. We put all the cars, trucks, and tractors on the top. All the military equipment was hidden under the decks.
CIA agents in Cuba reported that Russian troops and missile trailers had been seen in the streets of Havana. Washington dismissed the reports as rumor.
Yo vi aquella arma rara.
I saw those weird weapons, and then I said to my friend Pablo,
Le dije a Pablo,
Pablo, how powerful are these weird weapons? And he answered, these are nuclear missiles. So I thought, oh, really powerful. They just put them here, out in the open.
But the CIA had noticed the increase in Soviet ships heading for Cuba. On October the 14th, a U-2 spy plane was ordered to fly across the island to try to discover what was going on. The next morning, the Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington started analyzing the pictures that the U-2 had taken.
We're looking at the photography, and we spot objects that are foreign to the environment. And we kept looking, and we said, this is an SS-4 ballistic missile site. So working with the photo interpreters, we became convinced that this was it.
The Soviets had never put any nuclear weapons outside the Soviet borders. And we didn't think they'd do it, you know. Well, the truth of the matter is, it never dawned on us that they would take that kind of risk.
At 8:45 a.m. on October the 16th, the CIA informed Kennedy that without any doubt, there were Soviet missiles in Cuba. The president called his advisors to the White House.
We didn't spend a great deal of time wondering why the Soviets were doing this, because why they had done it, for whatever reason they had done it in a surreptitious way, lying to the United States through a variety of messages and messengers that they were only putting defensive weapons into Cuba. And those weapons constituted a clear and present danger to our security.
The missiles in Cuba made the Americans more vulnerable than ever before. The Russians were so close, they could strike without warning.
The first strike would have knocked out all the American air bases, bomber bases, all the American missile bases, and all American cities except Seattle, which was out of their range. But Washington, D.C., New York City, Dallas would have all gone to the hammer.
We talked about the possibility of an airstrike, which was at one time or another almost everybody's first choice upon first thought, to knock out the missiles. We talked about an invasion of Cuba, which was always the preferred choice of the right wing, go in and take Cuba away from Castro and rid the island of communism while at the same time getting rid of these missiles. A diplomatic approach, either bilaterally or through the United Nations. A blockade or quarantine, as it later came to be called. No decision was made at that first meeting, but if a vote had been taken there, airstrike was probably number one on everybody's list.
Robert Kennedy, the president's brother and closest advisor, became concerned that if America's might was used without warning against a small island, world opinion would turn against them.
Robert Kennedy, rightfully in my opinion, drew the analogy that it would be regarded by the world as a bombing of Cuba, of bases in Cuba, comparable to the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese in 1941. And he said, I don't think I want my brother to become another Tojo.
As the arguments continued, the Soviet foreign minister, Andrei Gromyko, and the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrynin, kept a long-standing engagement at the White House.
The president raised the question of the increasing tension between our two countries in connection with the Soviet deliveries of weapons. The president said, we're worried about it because it's connected with our own safety and security. Gromyko told him, just as I was told to say, that all our deliveries, Mr. President, are of a defensive nature. If you don't intend to invade Cuba, you shouldn't worry, because all the weapons are defensive.
It was a clear intent to deceive. If the U.S. were not to respond to Soviet deception, how would this influence the attitude of our NATO allies? How would they view the U.S. guarantee of their security? And how would it influence the future behavior of the Soviet Union? If they got by with deception once, couldn't they do it again?
For the next 2 days, Kennedy stayed away, keeping up with a congressional election campaign. In Washington, his advisors tried to come up with a solution.
There were no good solutions. Every solution was full of holes and risks. It was the only time during my 3 years in the White House that I would wake up in the middle of the night agonizing over what was the right approach, what would work, what would not blow up the world.
A conclusion was reached, not to bomb, but to blockade. The Navy would stop and search all ships heading for Cuba. They called it a quarantine.
It was believed that the quarantine would convey to Khrushchev the determination of the president to see that those missiles were removed without stimulating a military response.
But in case the quarantine didn't work, preparations were made for airstrikes, and a massive American invasion force was made ready. President Kennedy was in Chicago. Now he was needed in Washington. The press were growing suspicious.
I was called by President Kennedy at 8 o'clock in the morning, and he said, "Come to my room." And he still had his bathrobe on, and he said, "Here's something I'm writing for you. You're going to hold a press conference to announce it."
The assistant White House physician, Dr. George Berkeley, noticed that the president's voice was very husky. This morning, when he examined the president, he found the president had developed a slight temperature and that he was suffering from a minor upper respiratory ailment. The president therefore canceled his schedule for the rest of today and tomorrow and has returned to Washington and the White House.
About halfway to Washington, I suddenly found myself alone with Kennedy in the front part of the airplane. I said, "Mr. President, you're not sick. What the hell's going on?" He said to me, "You're going to find out as soon as you land in Washington, and then grab your balls."
Good morning, everyone. An unusual flurry of top-secret military and diplomatic activity over the weekend has Washington guessing today that a major move in American foreign policy may be imminent. The speculation centers on the Caribbean and possible action against Cuba.
That afternoon, the Soviet ambassador was called to an urgent meeting with Secretary of State Dean Rusk.
Rusk said, "You are delivering missiles to Cuba. We have aerial reconnaissance photographs. This is a threat to our security, and we cannot possibly allow it. In 1 hour's time, at 7 p.m., the President will make a radio and television appeal to the American people, where he will describe the situation. At the same time, he wants you to pass the message on to Khrushchev."
At 7 o'clock, Kennedy announced to the world for the first time the discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba, and that a blockade was now in force.
The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. He has an opportunity now to move the world back from the abyss of destruction.
The first response from Moscow came the next morning. Khrushchev was not going to back down.
Kennedy spoke about quarantine, and that sounded as something not very precise, perhaps not a blockade as it actually was. So the first reactions were pretty tough from the Soviet side.
Denouncing the United States arms quarantine against Cuba as a step toward world thermonuclear war, the Soviet Union today ordered its armed forces into a state of combat readiness, and forces of the Warsaw Pact, the communist counterpart of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, immediately followed suit.
As the superpowers prepared for conflict, Cuba announced a combat alarm. Over 250,000 people stood by to repel an American invasion.
We felt the danger. This was war. The country could be invaded at any time by the Americans.
If they invaded our country, I was convinced it would create the grave risk of the US taking the second step of carrying out a nuclear airstrike against the Soviet Union.
The American fleet now encircled Cuba. The Soviet ships stayed on course. With confrontation imminent, Kennedy wanted direct contact with Moscow. He sent his brother Robert to meet in secret with the Soviet ambassador.
He said, "Did your government instruct the captains to turn the ships back home because Kennedy introduced the quarantine?" I said, "No. Our captains have no such orders. And as far as I'm aware, they are instructed to go on to Cuba." According to international law, you have no right to stop our ships in the open sea. You cannot draw an imaginary line which cannot be crossed. It is against the law. He replied, "Well then, I don't know where we are heading."
The Pentagon says the United States is ready to sink every communist bloc ship headed for Cuba which refuses to stop and be searched under the blockade. Further, force will be used if necessary to stop and search any ship of any nation bound for Cuba.
I think that was the moment that really was the heart stopper. I recall being in the newsroom, just waiting for that next bulletin and almost literally trying to type with my fingers crossed.
Let's check over the Pentagon with Charles von Fremd on that. Chuck, is there any late information about the position of those Soviet ships or what might be happening to them?
Walter, we haven't heard a word for several hours now as to when the confrontation between U.S. vessels and the Soviet ships will come about.
Nerves were being stretched to breaking point. People tried to prepare for a possible nuclear holocaust. A wave of panic buying swept across America.
We have a utility room where the furnaces are, and we were wondering whether we could make that into a bomb shelter of some form. We were learning for the first time the time that we would have after the explosion before the fumes, the killing heat and so forth would reach us.
The Soviet leaders had tried to keep the crisis from their people, but the news was getting out.
The people felt the breath of war and were tense. I remember my parents felt doomed. They understood that war would not be like it was before, that it would be a war with atomic bombs.
This is a special report from CBS News.
Well, at its beginning, this day looked as though it might be one of armed conflict between Soviet vessels and American warships on the sea lanes leading to Cuba. But there has been no confrontation as far as we know, and some hope has been generated by suggestions of negotiation.
Almost at the last moment, the missile ships appeared to have slowed down or altered course. That evening, as Kennedy dined with friends at the White House, a toast was proposed to celebrate. Kennedy declined. The game, he said, was hardly over. At 9:24 p.m., the State Department received a letter from Khrushchev for the president. Khrushchev rejected all of Kennedy's demands. The missiles already in Cuba were being prepared for action. For the first time in its history, America's Strategic Air Command moved to Defense Condition 2. The next step, DEFCON 1, would be war. Just after dawn on the morning of the 25th, Kennedy ordered the interception of the Bucharest, a ship carrying Soviet oil. He knew there was no possibility of an oil tanker carrying missiles, but it was a signal to Khrushchev that he was deadly serious. That afternoon at the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson confronted his Soviet counterpart, Ambassador Zorin.
All right, sir. Let me ask you one simple question. Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sights in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no?
Я не нахожусь в американском суде.
I am not in an American courtroom, sir, and therefore I do not wish to answer a question that is put to me in the fashion in which a prosecutor does. In due course, sir, you will have your reply.
You're in a court of world opinion right now, and you can answer yes or no. You have denied that they exist. I want to know if I've understood you correctly.
As the Soviet ambassador prevaricated, the U-2 photographs were brought into the meeting for the world to see. With work continuing on the missile sites in Cuba, the buildup of US invasion forces in Florida increased. The Americans prepared for conventional combat. They were unaware that the Soviet forces were equipped with short-range tactical missiles tipped with atomic warheads, ready to annihilate any invader.
If they'd started an invasion using the Marines or the airborne forces, the losses would have been enormous. We would have fought to the last soldier, the last bullet. There was nowhere to retreat to.
On
the 26th of October, at a meeting with the Soviet military commander, I was informed about the state of the missiles. He told me, the air regiment is ready. The surface-to-air missiles are ready. The tactical nuclear missile unit is ready. Missiles ready.
On October the 26th, with tension increasing, Kennedy received a telegram from Khrushchev.
The most important paragraph in it is, Mr. President, Mr. Kennedy, you and I are like two men pulling on a rope with a knot in the middle. The harder we pull, the tighter the knot until it will have to be cut with a sword. Why don't we both let up the pressure and maybe we can untie the knot?
Khrushchev went on to offer that if the United States declared that they wouldn't invade Cuba, the necessity of the presence of our military specialists in Cuba will disappear. At last, it looked as if cooler heads were prevailing. The next morning, everything changed. Khrushchev tried to push for a better deal. He demanded a trade, his missiles in Cuba for US missiles in Turkey.
Khrushchev thought that if the withdrawal from Turkey could be incorporated in a general agreement between the two sides, that would look very good for the Soviet Union. Much even better than a simple decision by the United States not to attack Cuba.
President Kennedy was prepared to take the American missiles out of Turkey. But they were part of America's contribution to NATO, and he could offer Khrushchev no promises. As Kennedy considered the options, he received news that the crisis had escalated again. In continued American reconnaissance, a U-2 spy plane overflew a Soviet anti-aircraft site in the east of Cuba. This time, the Soviet commander gave the order to launch a surface-to-air missile against it.
The division commander, Lieutenant Colonel Gerchikov, was given the order to liquidate the target. If we hadn't shot down the plane which had photographed all of our bases, it would have enabled the enemy to destroy us. That would have meant we had not fulfilled our mission. We would have betrayed our motherland.
The kind of standby plan was if a U-2 was shot down, we would immediately bomb that SAM site out of existence. President Kennedy canceled that order. He said, don't bomb that anti-missile, anti-aircraft site. I want time to exchange with Khrushchev.
A war appeared imminent. A first strike might take place at any time. I said to myself, if Cuba is in such an unfortunate war, we will disappear from the map.
Castro sent a message to Khrushchev. He said a US attack was just hours away, and once launched, the Soviet Union should retaliate immediately with an annihilating strike. In Washington, Kennedy was still trying to avoid a world war.
Bobby Kennedy had this brilliant idea. He said, let's pick out of the Khrushchev cable the things we like and pretend that the rest isn't there. Jack Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy crafted this answer to Khrushchev that did just that. It ignored the shoot down of the U-2. It ignored the broadcast from Moscow that was very hawkish, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And just, we said, we understand what you were proposing, and then we listed the things we liked.
There was little confidence that this ploy would work. Plans for the invasion continued.
The tension on Saturday night was extraordinary because it was going to be the meeting where we were going to decide what time the next day we were going to invade Cuba, or was it going to be later, where we're going to be bombing those areas. And Kennedy started the meeting by saying, listen, all of you have not been home for at least 6-7 days. I want all of you to go home tonight, come back tomorrow morning, Sunday morning, and we'll make the decision Sunday morning.
They left the White House fearful that America could soon be engulfed in a nuclear war, a war that once started might be impossible to stop.
It was a perfectly beautiful night, as full nights are in Washington. I walked out of the President's Oval Office, and as I walked out, I thought I might never live to see another Saturday night.
Kennedy sent his brother to another meeting with a Soviet ambassador.
He came to me and said, "The situation is very tense. Your missiles have just shot down our plane. Our generals demand that we fight back. If we start bombing, you will start to fight back. What can we do?" I said, "What about Turkey?" He thought for a while and said, "You know, if that's the only condition which prevents us from striking a deal, then I'm authorized by the President to say that we agree to it."
We could not take them out under threat. We could not take them out unilaterally because they were NATO bases, but he had our assurance that they would be gone provided it was not done on a quid pro quo basis, and therefore the Russians could not talk about it.
And that was, I would say, the last thing that led to the decision to accept Kennedy's terms, that he would be willing to guarantee that there would be no attack on Cuba, but that the Soviet Union should withdraw all offensive weapons from Cuba.
Khrushchev, fearing that this might be the last chance to escape war, rushed a message accepting Kennedy's terms to Radio Moscow. It was broadcast to the world.
The Soviet government has ordered the dismantling of weapons in Cuba, as well as their crating and return to the Soviet Union.
Radio Moscow at 9 o'clock this morning. Mr. Khrushchev crating up his missiles and shipping them home.
The first news I heard on Sunday morning when I woke up was this broadcast from Khrushchev over the open air that the Soviet missiles were to be withdrawn under inspection and the crisis was over. I could hardly believe my ears.
This is the day we have every reason to believe when the world came out from under the most terrible threat of nuclear holocaust since the end of World War II.
Nosotros realmente nos sentimos indignados.
We were irate. How did we learn about this? Through the radio, on the morning of the 28th. They broadcast that an agreement had been reached between the Soviet Union and the United States, that Kennedy was offering Khrushchev a guarantee. It really was a disgraceful agreement. It never crossed my mind they would do anything like this.
The whole world was under the impression that Khrushchev had lost because he'd given in to the pressure of a strong president, that he'd taken everything out of Cuba but got nothing in return. No one knew about the agreement regarding the missiles in Turkey. If you ask who won or who lost, I'd say neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev.
Under close American surveillance, Soviet ships took the missiles back home.
There is no question that if it hadn't been solved, we had invaded Cuba, we would have been in a nuclear war. And the number of people who would have been killed around the world in that nuclear war would have been absolutely disastrous. That was the biggest crisis of the 20th century. And the fact that Kennedy solved it with Khrushchev is absolutely important because then we were moving into a totally different world.
Thousands of square miles were laid waste. Billions of dollars were spent. 3 million died as the Cold War moved to Vietnam. Dien Bien Phu, 1954, one of the defining battles of the Cold War. Despite substantial American backing, the French finally lost control of their Vietnamese colony. They were defeated by the communist-led army of General Giap.
The Dien Bien Phu campaign was a huge victory. It was the first time a poor feudal nation had beaten a great colonial power that had a modern industry and a massive army. The victory meant a lot, not just to us, but to people all over the world.
cho nên có ý nghĩa đối với dân tộc chúng tôi.
There was a new regime in Vietnam. It was nationalist, but it was also communist. After Dien Bien Phu, the French left Vietnam for good. An international peace conference temporarily divided Vietnam into North and South and agreed that countrywide elections would be held in 1956. America opposed the elections. They never took place.
It was felt that the elections could not be free in the North in particular. I would say that was part of it. The other was that a sense that even if free elections were held, they probably would be dominated by the communists, and the communists would gain control.
Ho Chi Minh, North Vietnam's leader, had lived in France and trained in Moscow. To many Vietnamese, he was a national hero, but Washington saw him as an instrument of the communist bloc. The North Vietnamese embarked on radical land reforms. Landowners and so-called rich peasants were persecuted, pilloried, and imprisoned. The party's cruel policies helped aggravate a refugee crisis. By 1955, close to 1 million people, some encouraged by American agents, had fled south. In South Vietnam, the United States underwrote the regime of President Diem, an anti-communist determined to resist Hanoi. Ruthless and autocratic, Diem was intolerant of any opposition. In 1960, to fight Diem and to unite the country under Hanoi, the communists created the National Liberation Front, known to its opponents as the Viet Cong. Such movements were encouraged by Moscow.
Не заглушить вам голос народа, голос правды, который звучит и будет звучать. Конец, могила колониальному рабству. Долой его и похоронить его чем глубже, тем лучше.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
Within a year of his election, after suffering the Bay of Pigs fiasco in Cuba and a crisis in Berlin, President Kennedy set out to show strength in Asia.
The objective was to prevent the dominoes from falling. The loss of Vietnam would trigger the loss of Southeast Asia and conceivably even the loss of India, and would strengthen the Chinese and the Soviet position across the world.
Village leaders in the south who supported Diem were being assassinated by the National Liberation Front, or Viet Cong. In 1961 alone, an estimated 4,000 Diem officials were killed. To isolate the peasants from Viet Cong control, Diem's troops burned entire villages to the ground. The inhabitants were moved into fortified strategic hamlets built under the supervision of American advisors. These upheavals were extremely unpopular and won new recruits for the Viet Cong. Advisors from the United States trained the South Vietnamese army in counterinsurgency. Violence was routine.
The actions of the ruler, President Diem, have been declared autocratic, and perhaps his personal actions are to some degree. But when one realizes the chaos he faced, the complete anarchy that existed there, it's conceivable that autocratic methods within a democratic framework were required to restore order.
The regime of Mr. Diem did create a kind of framework, a kind of government with all the structures for governing the country. Of course, his policy provoked a lot of discontent among the intellectuals.
Summer 1963, Saigon witnessed horrifying scenes. Buddhist monks burnt themselves to death in protest at Diem's religious intolerance. South Vietnamese protesters organized a wave of demonstrations. A group of generals plotted a coup against Diem and sounded out America's support.
You get cables like that from some part of the country or the world or the other almost every week. And there's a kind of a standard reply. You say the United States cannot participate in anything like this. We cannot aid it. We cannot do anything to be involved. And we will examine any new government on its own merits.
But Washington did nothing to stop the coup. President Kennedy was receiving mixed messages. Some officials even said America's Vietnam policy was succeeding.
They expected to withdraw the force of 16,000 military advisors by the end of '65, and that the first unit of withdrawal would be completed within 90 days by the end of December 1963.
Events overtook the plan to withdraw. On November the 1st, 1963, a group of generals attacked the presidential palace, believing that they had, or would have, American support. By the next day, the government was overthrown. Diem and his brother were murdered by their own soldiers after they had earlier taken refuge in a church. At first, the people of Saigon responded with enthusiasm to Diem's overthrow, but it left the country with no clear leader. Within 3 weeks of Diem's murder, President Kennedy was himself assassinated. As Kennedy was buried in Arlington Cemetery, America remained committed to South Vietnam.
We are going to build a great society where no man or woman are the victim of fear or poverty or hatred, where every man and woman has a chance for fulfillment and prosperity and hope.
Lyndon Johnson had vast ambitions at home, but like Kennedy, he was determined not to lose Vietnam to the communists.
How do you do? You know, the Vice Premier... is the commander. How do you do,
Johnson sent McNamara to re-pledge America to South Vietnam's cause. The strategy was unchanged, the promises more spectacular.
We'll stay for as long as it takes. We shall provide whatever help is required to win the battle against the communist insurgents.
General William Westmoreland, a veteran of Korea and World War II, took charge as President Johnson began to increase the American war effort.
This was the type of war that we'd had no experience with before. And we were on the learning curve. And some of our policies were kind of trial and error in character.
In August 1964, an American destroyer, the USS Maddox, on patrol in the Gulf of Tonkin, exchanged fire with North Vietnamese torpedo boats.
The President has asked that the destroyer force be doubled and that an air cap, the combat air patrol, be available at all times on call to it. And as I think you know, he's issued instructions that in the event of a further attack upon our vessels in international waters, we are to respond with the objective of destroying the attackers.
2 days later, the ship's captain thought he was again coming under attack. One of the pilots was not so sure.
Well, I was over those destroyers for over an hour and a half, below 1,000 feet, lights off, watching everything they did. I could hear them chit-chatting on the radio, the Maddox and the Joy. They seemed to have some intermittent radar targets. I took it upon myself to get out there where they thought a boat was and try to kill it if they didn't. But it was fruitless. And I'd go down there and there was nothing.
Ignoring the conflicting evidence, the Pentagon insisted there had been a second attack.
In retaliation for this unprovoked attack on the high seas, our forces have struck the bases used by the North Vietnamese patrol craft.
Johnson used the incident to push the Tonkin Gulf Resolution through Congress. It would allow the president to wage war in Vietnam. In South Vietnam, the Viet Cong was stepping up operations. They now had 170,000 men and women in the field. They could move and operate throughout most of the country. They repeatedly launched attacks in the heart of Saigon.
People were fighting back. We would establish contacts with them and guide them. The protest movement of students and intellectuals, including Catholics and Buddhists, was widespread. When people saw that our methods were effective, they would join us.
Saigon was in a constant state of crisis. Ministers came and went, with each regime as unpopular and corrupt as the last. Johnson was exasperated.
I was sitting with him one day when he got news that there was another coup in Vietnam and another general has ascended to the power platform, and he, frustrated, said, "God damn, I'm getting sick and tired of this goddamn coup shit in Vietnam. It's got to stop."
Johnson was in the throes of the 1964 election campaign. The great society he hoped to build was the central issue. But communism and the Cold War were, as ever, near the top of the agenda.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7.
Johnson played up Cold War fears in his election commercials, painting his Republican adversary as a trigger-happy warmonger.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
These are the stakes to make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd.
Johnson won by a landslide. North Vietnam was a peasant society with virtually no industry. Ho Chi Minh sought aid from China and the Soviet Union. In February 1965, Hanoi gave Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin a warm welcome. He agreed to increase military aid to the North Vietnamese.
We used to say, when Vietnam is reunited, it will be a wonderful example for the other nations of Southeast Asia. It was all in the context of an ideological struggle, the Cold War. The argument was about which system would last, which one was progressive. Here was a good example, people said. Look at Vietnam.
While Soviet Premier Kosygin was still in Hanoi, the Viet Cong launched an attack on Pleiku Air Base. 8 Americans were killed. 100 more were wounded. Johnson responded with air power. He launched Rolling Thunder, a campaign of bombing against the North. He hoped it would boost Southern morale and get Ho Chi Minh to the negotiating table. The North did not respond.
It became more and more clear that President Johnson was going to have to choose between losing South Vietnam or trying to save it by introducing U.S. military force and taking over a major part of the combat mission.
The first American ground troops landed at Da Nang in March 1965.
I can remember one of my squad leaders when we were leaving Okinawa, and he said, "Hot damn Vietnam." We were all kind of hot to go, hot to get into something, do something that was other than train and drill. And there was a kind of a feeling, I don't know if anybody ever said this, a sort of feeling that being U.S. Marines, our mere presence in Vietnam was going to terrify the enemy into quitting.
The United States had embarked on what would be the longest military war in its history. Three weeks after the Marines landed, the Viet Cong bombed the American embassy in Saigon. Johnson believed communist China lay behind such attacks.
Their target is not merely South Vietnam. It is Asia. Their objective is not the fulfillment of Vietnamese nationalism. It is to erode and to discredit America's ability to help prevent Chinese domination over all of Asia.
In fact, China was now supplying less aid than the Soviet Union. Although they got few aircraft, North Vietnamese pilots were being trained in the Soviet Union.
Our position was clear. Vietnam was defending its independence. It was fighting against the Americans, so we had to help them. And I must say that in the Soviet Union, this point of view was fully supported.
The situation in South Vietnam worsened as Viet Cong attacks continued. In June, a military outpost at Dong Xuay was destroyed. An elite South Vietnamese regiment was decimated, and there were many civilian casualties. McNamara returned to Vietnam to reassess the war. He looked for the statistics that would help him manage the conflict.
But somehow Mr. McNamara came in and he never let the Vietnamese general ask him the question one way or the other. And he came out and like a machine gun asking a lot of statistics like that, and with his yellow pad he put down all the indications, and as soon as the answers were given, he took up and left. He was not interested that much about the opinion of the Vietnamese at all.
President Johnson was now convinced that without the support of a massive American army, South Vietnam was doomed.
I have today ordered to Vietnam the Air Mobile Division and certain other forces which will raise our fighting strength from 75,000 to 125,000 men almost immediately. Additional forces will be needed later, and they will be sent as requested.
Vietnam was a television war.
Con, let's move in with those other guys. This is what the war in Vietnam is all about. The old and the very young. The Marines have burned this old couple's cottage because fire was coming from here.
150 homes were leveled in retaliation for a burst of gunfire. In Vietnam, like everywhere else in Asia, property, a home, is everything. A man lives with his family on ancestral land. His parents are buried nearby. Their spirit is part of his holding. If there were Viet Cong in the hamlets, they were long gone. The women and the old men who remained will never forget that August afternoon.
The Viet Cong kept fighting, but in response to the American troop buildup, Hanoi was preparing to send thousands of North Vietnamese to join the fighters in the south. Westmoreland feared that South Vietnam would be cut in two. In the Nha Trang Valley and the Central Highlands, the armies would meet head-on in the first major battle of the war.
The battle at Nha Trang was our first big victory. We concluded that we could fight the Americans and win. The key thing was to force the Americans to fight the way we wanted. That is, hand to hand.
Although the Americans defeated the North Vietnamese at Nha Trang, casualties were heavy. 2,000 North Vietnamese soldiers were killed. 300 elite American infantry died in the battle.
The attitude of the enemy was not comparable to what our attitude would have been under the circumstances. He was ready, willing, and able to pay a far greater price than I would say we Caucasians would.
My casualties in my company were relatively light, and I say relatively light. I lost 17 killed and about 43 wounded. So the unit was almost combat ineffective with those kind of casualties, but fortunately we were able to weather that particular piece of the battle.
The GIs had gone to South Vietnam to fight communism, but often they met hostility from those they thought they were helping. American troops found it impossible to tell which Vietnamese were friends and which were foes.
How do you distinguish a civilian from a Viet Cong? Well, of course, he shoots at you, or he's armed. But how about what happens after a firefight, and you find bodies out there, but no weapons? And we were told, this is, well, if it's dead in Vietnamese, it's VC. That was the exact words.
You would go out, you would secure a piece of terrain during the daylight hours, and you'd surrender that, and I mean literally surrender, not be forced off. Well, maybe surrender is probably not a good word, but you'd give it up because the helicopters would come in and pick you up at night and fly you back to the security of your base camp.
Instead of trying to hold territory, the Americans used their superior mobility to launch search and destroy missions. The attempt to save South Vietnam was destroying it. Viet Cong operations continued.
Đúng 8 giờ, đêm 22 sáng 23 đó.
At 8 o'clock in the morning of March the 23rd, we hit them.
Thì kết quả hủy diệt.
Our artillery destroyed aircraft.
Và chết một.
We killed not only some guards, but also the American quartermaster.
Đại tá gần. Còn lính tráng đó thì không tính.
Our commando unit also attacked the police training school. We killed many trainee police officers whilst they were watching a movie.
In another attempt to encourage the North Vietnamese to negotiate, Johnson stopped Rolling Thunder. Then started it again. The tactic failed. The Communists' vital supply route was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was a network of tracks linking the north with the south via the jungles of central Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia.
The enemies assumed we dared not drive during the day. In fact, we drove both day and night. We had to keep changing our tactics to keep ahead of the enemy. Their plan of attacking the trail was very malicious and changed all the time. But we outmaneuvered them.
One night we counted 14 cannons firing, reddening and lightening the whole sky with explosions. It was like fireworks night in Hanoi. We were constantly driving through bullets and smoke.
The trail wove through theoretically neutral Laos and Cambodia. Both suffered heavy American bombing.
Over the years, Cambodia, the border area of Cambodia and Laos were used freely by the enemy, but by virtue of the policy of my government, we could not fight overt war or deploy troops overtly, military troops, into those countries.
On one or two occasions, the chiefs recommended U.S. military intervention in North Vietnam and stated that they recognized this might lead to Chinese and/or Soviet military response, in which case they said we might have to consider the use of nuclear weapons.
The president was worried about China and Russia. He didn't know. You know, in Korea, nobody thought the Chinese were going to cross the Yalu with 1 million men, and we were caught by surprise. And I remember time after time when the military would suggest mining Haiphong or having sending in warplanes to bomb Haiphong. He said, hell no. He said, some damn aviator would drop a bomb down a Russian smokestack, and then I've got World War III on my hand.
The scale of Soviet aid to North Vietnam was affected by growing tensions between the Soviet Union and China.
The Chinese demanded that we hand over all military equipment for Vietnam on the Soviet-Chinese border, and that China, in its turn, would pass it on to the Vietnamese. We discovered later that the Chinese weren't handing everything over. Some of the equipment they unloaded for themselves.
What surprised me was that we could send the newest anti-aircraft missiles to Egypt, a capitalist country, but not to Vietnam. Our commanders used to say that it was because there was a danger they would fall into the hands of the Chinese.
Moscow sent missiles to North Vietnam, and more than 1,000 Soviet advisors worked on air defenses against the Americans.
When they entered our target zone, we saw 6 planes on our screen. With the first missile, we shot a plane. We fired a second ahead of the plane, and the plane flew into the missile. None of the pilots survived.
Each year, the American casualty rate increased.
And when I would go in the president's bedroom, 7 o'clock in the morning, every morning, he'd be on the phone with a 12-hour time difference, checking the casualties of the day before. Mr. President, we lost 18 men yesterday. Mr. President, we lost 160 men. We had 400 casualties. Morning after morning after morning.
At the beginning of 1967, the Americans used B-52s to bomb communist bases near the South Vietnamese capital, Saigon. They were trying to clear the area of Viet Cong. The savagery and apparent futility of the war aroused increasing dissent back home.
This confused war has played havoc with our domestic destinies. Despite feeble protestations to the contrary, the promises of the Great Society have been shot down on the battlefield of Vietnam. The pursuit of this widened war has narrowed the promised dimensions of the domestic welfare programs, making the poor, white and Negro, bear the heaviest burdens both at the front and at home.
Desperate to put more pressure on Hanoi, in August, Johnson extended the bombing of the North to within 10 miles of the Chinese border.
First, I would like to make it clear that these airstrikes are not intended as any threat to Communist China, and they do not, in fact, pose any threat to that country. We believe that Peking knows that the United States does not seek to widen the war in Vietnam.
Johnson was weakened by the growth of the anti-war movement in America.
Come on, mothers throughout the land, pack your boys off to Vietnam. Come on, fathers, don't hesitate. Send your sons off before it's too late. Be the first one on your block. Have your boy come home in a box. And it's 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7. Open up the pearly gates. Yeah, there ain't no time to wonder why we all gonna die.
When you turned on AFN and you saw riots in the streets and whatever, and guys were saying, wait a minute, why am I fighting here when these guys at home are saying this is the wrong thing to do?
In public, Johnson staged a show of optimism and support for General Westmoreland and his troops.
The enemy is not beaten, but he knows that he has met his master in the field. He is trying to buy time, hoping that our nation's will does not match his will.
In 1968, in the fields and on the rivers, massive preparations were being made by the communists for concerted attacks throughout South Vietnam. Weapons, ammunition and supplies were moved to the south for an offensive planned for the Vietnamese New Year, Tet. The communists hoped to spark a general uprising across the country.
Taxis carried chrysanthemums into Saigon for the Tet market. Hidden underneath them were AK-47s. The people supported the revolution. They helped us. We were able to penetrate the security in the city. We changed our clothes and carried fake identity documents. The people of Saigon hid us in their houses.
I didn't want the enemy to know that I knew what was going to happen. I did know. I made a mistake in not making that known to the American public because they were caught by surprise.
The strength of the Tet Offensive came as a shock to Westmoreland and the American public. On television, they saw their South Vietnamese allies fighting the Viet Cong in the streets of Saigon itself. Worse still, they saw the American embassy penetrated by Viet Cong commandos.
Now CIA men and MPs have gone into the embassy and are trying to get the snipers out by themselves.
With the Tet Offensive at its height, leading American politicians were turning on the president.
It is said the Viet Cong will not be able to hold the cities, and that is probably true. But they have demonstrated, despite all of our reports of progress, of government strength, and of enemy weakness, that 500,000 American soldiers, with 700,000 Vietnamese allies, with total command of the air, total command of the sea, backed by the huge resources and the most modern weapons, that we are unable to secure even a single city from the attacks of an enemy whose total strength is about 250,000.
The fiercest battle was to recapture the ancient city of Hue.
How long do you think it's going to take you to get through this city?
We'll be here in a few weeks anyway, cleaning it out. It'll take a little while to get it out of here.
You lost any friends?
Quite a few. We lost one the other day, good buddy. The whole thing stinks, really.
When Hue was eventually retaken, the Americans found that thousands of civilians had been murdered by the communists. Tet was a major defeat for the Viet Cong. Their main objective, to inspire a nationwide uprising, had failed. But Johnson had been stunned by the scale of the Tet Offensive. Disillusioned, Secretary of Defense McNamara was leaving office. Johnson replaced him with Clark Clifford.
I'd ask questions like, when is the war going to end? Well, we don't know. How many more men do you think we're going to lose? Well, we really don't know. And I finally got down to it and said, what is our plan to win the war in Vietnam? Turned out there wasn't any. The plan was just to stay with it and ultimately hoping that the enemy would finally give up.
Johnson was persuaded that the war could not be won on the battlefield, and that he must negotiate.
I renew the offer I made last August to stop the bombardment of North Vietnam. We ask that talks begin promptly, that they be serious talks on the substance of peace.
What he said next surprised the world.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
In May 1968, peace negotiations began in Paris. They were soon deadlocked. The Communists were determined to rule a united Vietnam, but the United States was not prepared to abandon the South. As the difficult negotiations continued, the Republicans were campaigning for the presidency. In public, Richard Nixon supported Johnson's peace efforts.
I have pointed out time and again that at a time that the President of the United States has a responsibility and is trying to negotiate in Paris for an honorable end to the war, that we should give him every chance to bring that war to a conclusion before this election and before his term ends, and that certainly no candidate for president, and certainly I will not make any statement that might pull the rug out from under him and that might destroy the chance to bring the war to a conclusion.
In fact, Nixon's campaign team was having secret talks with the South Vietnamese government.
I was in touch with the Republicans, with the entourage of Mr. Nixon, and the Republicans urged us to stand firm.
The worst point was, at least for Lyndon Johnson, was when he realized that negotiations were stalled. And I do know this, that he heard close to the election time in '68 that Nixon, or one of Nixon's emissaries, was telling the South Vietnamese, don't make a deal, you get a better deal under Nixon.
America's war in Vietnam was to last another 4 years. At the start of the 1960s, Cold War tensions were heightening. Confrontation threatened. The two superpowers watched and waited, preparing for a nuclear holocaust. The world's safety depended on mutual assured destruction, the threat of mutual suicide that came to be known as MAD, MAD.
It's not mad. Mutual assured destruction is the foundation of deterrence.
On the 1st of July 1960, an American RB-47 reconnaissance plane like this took off on a routine mission to probe the radar defenses of the Soviet border.
We took off from Bryce-Norton Air Base in England. That was our forward operating location on that particular date. And we were supposed to fly this quote-unquote milk run. There's not supposed to be any particular problems during a particular flight. And we thought that this would be a rather simple flight, although it was a 12-hour mission.
They flew in order to detect our radar stations. They wanted to know the location of the air defense system of the Soviet Union. They often flew close to our borders.
We started flying parallel to the Soviet coastline, which had Murmansk and the mouth of the White Sea and so forth up there. And we knew there was quite a bit of activity going on up there by the Russians at that time.
I was on combat duty to intercept, and I flew up to find the enemy. I was guided from the ground. When I saw the enemy plane, I identified it and radioed my base.
The co-pilot said, check, 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 right wing, and the aircraft commander, Major Palm, said, where the hell did that guy come from?
I signaled the plane to follow me. He wouldn't obey. I radioed my base and asked what I should do. An order came back, destroy it. I opened fire, and the plane started to burn.
As the MiG fighters returned to base, John McCone and co-pilot Bruce Olmsted parachuted to safety and imprisonment in Moscow's Lubyanka prison. The 4 other Americans on board had died in midair. On the front line, constant vigilance. War, if it came, would soon go nuclear. American Titan missiles, each with a warhead that could destroy Moscow, were ready to be launched.
It would be done before we had time to stop and think about what we were doing. It doesn't take all that long, and It was just automatic. There was no question in our mind that this was the thing to do.
If we had ever received a launch message over the PAS system, I would have had absolutely no doubt that my life expectancy was measured in probably less than a half an hour. And the only question was, would we be able to launch this missile before the incoming hit us?
Pearl Harbor was still a painful wound in the American psyche. In Alaska, Greenland, and England, ballistic missile early warning radars were in operation. America did not want to be surprised again.
The Cold War was a war that went on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We felt that they were trying to take over the world, and actually we were one of their largest stumbling blocks in that effort. Therefore, we were one of their primary enemies, and their primary target was to take over our country.
They were banging it into our heads, and we couldn't have imagined otherwise. The Americans were aggressors who wanted to conquer the whole world, and we had to protect the world.
In 1961, the new American president, John Kennedy, had taken office in a tense nuclear world. He inherited from Eisenhower the doctrine of massive retaliation.
The term massive retaliation, as it was understood at the end of the 1950s and the beginning of the 1960s, was a policy of responding to major Soviet conventional attacks, for example, in Western Europe, should that have occurred, with a massive nuclear response.
Massive retaliation had been conceived at a time of clear American superiority. Now, the Russians were trying to catch up.
There was a syndrome to catch up and overtake, to try and show everyone that we weren't far behind the Americans, that we too had nuclear weapons. There were those who said that we can only prevent a nuclear war if we oppose world imperialism with a force of similar strength.
Khrushchev sought a dramatic means to remind the West of the power of the Soviets. He broke a moratorium on nuclear testing. October the 30th, 1961. A Russian bomber crew were preparing to drop the largest bomb the world had ever seen.
Одна.
The explosion was the equivalent of more than 50 million tons of TNT, more than all the explosives used in World War II. "50 miles away, people were blown off their feet. Khrushchev said he wanted the bomb to hang like the sword of Damocles over the imperialists' heads. Kennedy took up the challenge.
In view of the Soviet action, it will be the policy of the United States to proceed in developing nuclear weapons to maintain this superior capability for the defense of the free world against any aggressor.
To Kennedy's anger, the super bomb was just one of a series of Soviet nuclear tests.
I remember counting down the seconds, then dropping the bomb. We had to put on special glasses and pull down curtains to protect us against the radiation. We'd put on the glasses, but we'd forget to draw the curtains as we wanted to have a peek. Suddenly, there'd be something like a rising sun. The clouds disperse, and you see a beautiful, beautiful picture, like in a fairy tale. A mushroom growing up and up. It's on top of you, and you're going underneath. The instruments measuring the level of radiation went right off the scale. But of course we forgot about that. Then suddenly there is a huge blow as the shockwave hits the plane. All the controls go crazy, and you have to grab the joystick and quickly try and get it under control. The plane was thrown from side to side. We knew what a nuclear explosion was like.
It became obvious that the Russians there was no containing them. They were shooting not just this big bomb, but lots and lots of them. And we essentially did the same thing. We went and, we got bombs from wherever we could find them and took them to Nevada and shot them just in order to respond to these Russian tests. It was a crazy period.
In the West, public opinion was turning against the arms buildup and the testing of the bomb. In Britain, what started in 1958 as a march to the weapons centre at Aldermaston swelled to an annual rally of tens of thousands of campaigners for nuclear disarmament.
We did seriously accept the fact that if a nuclear bomb was used in the London area, the effect was going to be so massive over such a geographical area that even people living miles out would have repercussions. And we were quite serious in our expectation that this could happen. The scientists have made it, it's there and available. Somebody's going to want to use it.
Kennedy and his Secretary of Defense McNamara were increasingly aware of the danger of relying on the strategy of massive retaliation.
Nuclear weapons have no military utility whatsoever, excepting only to deter one's opponent from their use, which means you should never, never, never initiate their use against a nuclear-equipped opponent. If you do, it's suicide. And that conclusion I came to very early. As I say, when I came in, I didn't know the difference between a nuclear weapon and a conventional weapon. But it didn't take me long to find out, a few months, and I came to that conclusion. The problem was how to implement the conclusion.
McNamara presented the Joint Chiefs of Staff with an appealing alternative. Soviet cities were no longer to be targeted. They were to strike only at Soviet military forces. This was known as No Cities Counterforce.
And if both sides did that, then the casualties in the unlikely and very undesirable prospect of a nuclear war would be less.
This idea of a no cities plan is striking only against military bases, rocket forces and submarines. It was simply an attempt to make nuclear war morally acceptable. It was an attempt to deceive oneself.
The Russians weren't the only skeptics. The head of the Strategic Air Command, General Power, was briefed on counterforce by one of McNamara's assistants.
General Power insisted that the only way to deal with these barbarians was to blow them all up. And I said, but who's going to win that? And he said, I would be satisfied if there were just 2 Americans left and 1 Russian. That would be, we would have won. And I said, well, there'd better be one of them a woman.
October 1962. Khrushchev, seeking to reduce American nuclear superiority, sent Soviet missiles into Cuba.
It was real. You know, this was no joke. They were moving mid-range missiles into Cuba, and I don't think there's any doubt about the fact they were moving. They may have had some there already. They certainly had the facilities to rapidly introduce them. That was tense.
Kennedy ordered a blockade and put his forces across the globe on the highest alert. B-52s loaded with hydrogen bombs were ready for war.
During the Cuban crisis, if the horn blew, we shook like the devil. I mean, we were scared. We said, we're on our way. So we simply ran to that airplane and fired up the ground carts to get power to the airplane and air to start the engine. And we cranked those engines as fast as we could, and we would listen for a message from Strategic Air Command to give us instructions on what type of exercise it was, if it was a practice or if it was a real thing. You know, you literally swallowed because you didn't know what it was going to be.
Confronted by Kennedy's nuclear superiority, Khrushchev turned the missile ships back.
Both Khrushchev's government and Kennedy's government proved to be wise enough to find their way out of this situation. The Cuban Missile Crisis was very important. It showed just how close to the edge of the nuclear precipice the world was standing.
Moscow and Washington realized that direct communication between the two capitals must be improved. They installed the hotline between them. The following summer, shocked at how close they'd come to nuclear war, the Soviet Union, America and Britain agreed a limited test ban treaty. There would be no more atmospheric tests. Nuclear testing would continue, but underground. In Russia, the Kremlin had learned a lesson. Never again did it want to confront America from a position of weakness.
Lack of nuclear armaments and the weakness of the Soviet Union came as a shock to the Soviet leadership. It was like a cold shower for the government, who realized that these weaknesses had to be overcome.
The Soviet Union built up their nuclear forces. They added hundreds of missiles to their arsenal. The Americans had to accept that, realistically, they could no longer destroy all the Soviet forces.
It became clear that if you said that your main approach was going to be to target the other side's military capability, what would happen is that those targets would proliferate to the point where there would be no limit to the amount that you would spend on strategic forces. The military on both sides accepted that they could no longer protect their own country from destruction.
The superpowers had discovered they had one thing in common: an interest in avoiding nuclear war.
It is an ironic but accurate fact that the two strongest powers are the two in the most danger of devastation. All we have built, all we have worked for, would be destroyed in the first 24 hours. And even in the Cold War, which brings burdens and dangers to so many countries, including this nation's closest allies, our two countries bear the heaviest burdens. For we are both devoting massive sums of money to weapons that could be better devoted to combat ignorance, poverty, and disease.
A grim logic was beginning to emerge. Nuclear disarmament was not achievable, yet nuclear war was unthinkable. By 1964, McNamara had concluded that his No Cities plan was a dangerous illusion. War would only be avoided, he now thought, by the threat of mutual suicide.
McNamara, in particular, became totally convinced that the only strategy was what is known as mutually assured destruction, MAD for short. And what that meant was that the only way to have stable deterrence in the world was for both sides to be able to kill 25 to 50% of the other's population.
It's not MAD. Mutual assured destruction is the foundation of deterrence. Today, it's a derogative term, but it's those who denigrate it don't understand deterrence. If you want a stable nuclear world, if that isn't an oxymoron, let me rephrase it, to the degree one can achieve a stable nuclear world, it requires that each side be confident that it can deter the other. And that requires that there be a balance. And the balance is the understanding that if either side initiates the use of nuclear weapons, the other side will respond with sufficient power to inflict unacceptable damage.
Submarines now played a crucial role.
3, 2, 1, fire!
For MAD to succeed, each side needed to be able to retaliate even after it had suffered a surprise attack.
The Polaris system to begin with was really a city killer.
It was an extremely survivable, assured destruction capability that the Soviets knew they could not destroy, and knew that if they conducted a first strike, that system would someday be available to retaliate. It might take some time to get the message to them from a destroyed national headquarters, but someday the warheads would come raining in, and they would pay the price. I don't think there would have been any hesitation on the part of any commanding officer to launch. Did we think about what was back home? Sure we did. But you didn't let that control your actions. Time to think about that after you've done your duty.
The fact that very tense people were close to nuclear weapons, ready to use those weapons, presented a huge danger to the world. And of course we felt uncomfortable, but we still had to accomplish our task, like the Americans had to accomplish theirs, and we would have accomplished it. What would it have ended in? It would have had very sad consequences for the world.
I thought from the beginning it was morally bankrupt, decrepit, morally I just do not accept war. That the primary objective of war is to kill people. Primary objective of war is to win a bloody thing with as few losses to, first of all, to your own side, and second to the other side. Always you want to minimize losses on both sides, but first of all yourself. But you want to win the thing and get it over as soon as possible.
If the first day had involved attacks on cities, then it would have been just unbelievably catastrophic. Tens of millions of deaths and enormous destruction. Even one thermonuclear weapon on a large city would be destructive on an almost unimaginable and unprecedented scale. World War II killed 50 million people, but it didn't do it in one day.
In 1963, Peter Watkins, a British filmmaker, made a drama documentary to show what a nuclear war would mean.
9:16 a.m. A single megaton nuclear missile overshoots Manston Airfield in Kent and airbursts 6 miles from this position. At this distance, the heat wave is sufficient to cause melting of the upturned eyeball, 3rd-degree burning of the skin, and ignition of furniture. 12 seconds later, the shock front arrives. The blast wave from a thermonuclear explosion has been likened to an enormous door slamming in the depths of hell.
The film was called The War Game. The BBC banned it. It wasn't seen on television for 20 years.
There was, for a period of a couple of years, at least a year, a strong effort to persuade the American public that it was worth investing in and practicing civil defense. That campaign fell flat. The public wasn't very interested. I think the public concluded that if a thermonuclear war were to take place, civil defense, although it might preserve some lives, would not preserve most lives, and what came afterwards would have made life not worth living.
Whether you're sitting in your desk next to the window or standing in the elevator shaft, it wouldn't be of any great significance if the bomb were dropped in this area within a radius of 25 miles.
I assume you're supposed to go to a shelter, but in a city like New York, there's not much chance that a person would survive if there was an attack or something.
In the case of a real attack, nobody would know what to do, I'm quite sure.
Officially, the Russians took civil defense more seriously, but the reality was not encouraging.
When people began to realize how dangerous these weapons were, they used to joke that if a nuclear bomb was dropped nearby, all they'd be left to do was to cover yourself with a white bedsheet and crawl to the cemetery. If you could make it to the cemetery, that is.
The leaders were guided by the idea that, as there might not be a nuclear war, why spend money which we were so short of? On the other hand, if there was a war, civil defense would not help. It was a very sensible, purely pragmatic Russian attitude.
Even short of total war, deterrence carried its own dangers. In 1966, over the coast of Spain, a B-52 was due to attempt a routine refueling mid-air from a tanker. In the village of Palomares, Simo Ortez was setting out for the day's fishing.
I was fishing opposite Villaricos, and the planes were flying overhead. We always used to watch the planes. There were two B-52s refueling, and the ones at the back must have brushed against each other, and the planes exploded.
I remember all this fire in the air and pieces of aeroplane falling to the ground. I remember all the neighbors running to the place where the smoke came from. We thought that what had fallen there was still burning.
As the planes broke up, 4 hydrogen bombs were scattered over the coast. 3 hit the ground, 1 was lost at sea.
I saw it very clearly. The bomb fell into the sea, very close to me. And then I saw how much interest the Americans showed. The whole Sixth Fleet came. There were 5,000 soldiers living on land in tents. Generals, colonels, so many important people from North America.
The American fleet searched the ocean for the missing bomb. Those on dry land had different problems. When the bombs hit the ground, safety devices prevented a thermonuclear explosion. But the conventional high explosives used to trigger a nuclear blast had gone off, scattering radioactive plutonium.
They started doing medical checkups here in the town with a Geiger counter. Some people had to throw away their clothes because they were contaminated. The houses were washed down with detergent or water. At no stage did the Americans tell us anything. People were scared because no one knew what was happening. All you knew was that you were forbidden to eat things, that you couldn't go out on the street, you couldn't touch anything. Everything but everything was permanently prohibited.
Over 4,500 barrels of contaminated soil were shipped back to the United States for burial. At sea, the search continued for the missing bomb. The Spanish feared that the Mediterranean was contaminated. American ambassador, Biddle Duke, went swimming for the cameras.
Question, can you detect any radioactivity in the water? if this is radioactivity, I love it.
80 days after the accident, an American mini-submarine, Alvin, found the missing bomb intact. The Pentagon called a lost nuclear bomb a broken arrow. Palomares was the 14th broken arrow since 1950. More were to come. The number of Soviet accidents is still unknown. The Russian military were unconvinced by McNamara's notion of assured destruction. They saw it as their first duty to protect their homeland. They worked to develop anti-ballistic missiles, ABMs, which could destroy American missiles in flight.
В свое время это был щит и меч. Был танк и было противотанковое орудие. Был самолет.
First there used to be a sword, and then a shield.
И вот показалось, что
Then a tank and anti-tank gun.
неуязвимым средством, что уровень
Now it turned out that a missile was not invulnerable.
такого рубежа
Science and technology was developing so fast, it had become possible to fight the most dangerous, most invincible weapons.
неуязвимым оружием.
To the United States, Russia's ABMs came as a blow. It was a terrible paradox. By building a defensive system, Russia had put the delicate nuclear balance at risk.
Считалось, что система ПРО — это зонтик.
We thought of it as an umbrella. Would an umbrella harm anybody? If it rains, you open it up. That was how we saw the ABM system. It was an umbrella to protect our population against a possible missile strike.
In terms of MAD, if you believe in mutually assured destruction, anything that interferes with both sides, see, it's mutual assured destruction. It must be mutual, and it must be assured. So anything on either side that it would interfere with both sides, either or both sides, capability to kill 20 to 50% of the population of the other side is, by definition, destabilizing.
The introduction of ABMs destabilized MAD, the balance of terror. We were both so afraid of nuclear armaments. We knew that you wouldn't strike and we wouldn't strike. But now, if one side could counter the other's ability to respond, then they had the advantage.
America, too, had been developing an ABM system, but McNamara was reluctant to authorize production. The system was easy to beat, and the sums just didn't add up.
The ratio of cost to the defender as against the offense was very unfavorable in that it would cost, say, like $5 to the defense to counter every dollar that the offense spent. And therefore, the economics just strongly favored the offense.
McNamara convinced President Johnson to abandon ABMs, but only if the Soviets agreed to do the same. In 1967, war in the Middle East raised international tension to boiling point. America supported Israel, the Soviet Union supported Egypt, Syria, and Jordan.
The Israelis have released these dramatic aerial pictures to support their claim to have shot down 6 MiG fighters of the Syrian Air Force.
Israel swiftly inflicted a crushing defeat. America, fearful that the Soviet Union might come to Egypt's aid, prepared the Sixth Fleet for action.
Six-day war between Israel and Egypt. And as a part of that, the hotline was used for the first time. And one of the messages from Kosygin to President Johnson was, if you want war, you'll get war. And these were very, very tense times.
To reduce the tension, President Johnson and Soviet Premier Kosygin agreed to meet at Glassboro, New Jersey. In spite of the Middle East crisis, ABMs were high on their agenda.
The president and the premier had a meeting, and the president started speaking. He said, let's come to an agreement. Let's each not build such expensive ABM systems. Kosygin said, I'm against this. Why do you object to a system that protects people? Defense is something moral, and aggression is immoral. Missiles mean aggression. If you agreed to reduce the number of aggressive missiles, then I could speak about reducing our defense system.
Whilst the arguments over ABMs continued, American scientists were preparing a countermeasure. Multiple, independently targeted re-entry vehicles, MIRVs for short. One single missile could now carry 10 separate warheads, each capable of destroying a city.
Once you got into the MIRV era, the problem of strategic defense became infinitely more complicated, infinitely more expensive, because you had to devise ways of going after a multiplicity of warheads and all kinds of junk that would be put into the atmosphere to mislead the defense.
Одной противоракетой можно поразить по существу одну баллистическую.
One anti-ballistic missile is enough to shoot down one ballistic missile.
Баллистическая ракета имеет.
But now imagine that a ballistic missile has 10 separate warheads.
Тогда, значит, возникает необходимость.
In order to shoot down one of those missiles, you would need at least 10 anti-ballistic missiles.
Против нее по меньшей мере 10 противоракет.
Here are two figures for you to compare. The United States of America had on their land-based launching sites alone 1,054 ballistic missiles.
1054 ракеты
To counter that, we would have needed over 10,000 anti-ballistic missiles. That would be madness.
The
Soviet Union realized that unless we stopped the arms race, then the Americans, who were financially better off, could outdo the Soviet Union. The leadership began to understand that now we had to choose between building socialism and communism or making missiles.
By 1969, the superpowers were, between them, spending more than $50 million a day on nuclear armaments. It was a burden both sides were finding intolerable. At last, they agreed to meet in Helsinki to try to halt the arms race. The negotiations came to be known as SALT.
Well, SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitations Talks. It was an effort, in the light of later events, a rather modest effort to try and put some kind of a cap on the accumulation of strategic delivery systems.
The bargaining was not going to be easy.
It was like diving into a swamp with your eyes closed. There were a lot of doubts and difficulties in organizing these things, particularly because before going to the talks, the members of the delegation were called up by Brezhnev and very seriously warned not to say too much. He reminded them that the KGB was listening and the Lubyanka prison was watching.
The Soviets were far more hesitant about doing anything that might involve some sort of intrusion into their society, because inevitably anything to do with real arms control would involve inspection, verification, and so on and so forth. And this, for the Soviets, remained anathema.
Negotiations dragged on throughout 1970 and 1971, as each side tried to come to terms with the other's philosophy.
The Soviets really had it in their gut, in the marrow of their bone, this right, this inherent right of a nation to defend itself. And there wasn't really any argument in those days, early days, of a technical nature, of a strategic, analytical nature. It was just the God-given, they wouldn't have said God, right of a nation to defend itself.
The Soviet Union felt naked, unprotected, surrounded everywhere by American nuclear forces. It was very difficult to protect the Soviet Union. When we had developed our own ballistic missiles, although we had very few, we realized that it had acted as a counterbalance. But when we started the talks, we remembered all the kinds of weapons that could reach us.
Behind the scenes, Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor, arranged private meetings with Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin.
These meetings made it possible to introduce corrections or amendments without losing face. Using the back channel with Kissinger, we could first state the official point of view and then talk more freely. I would say, Henry, mind you, or you should realize. I was really just thinking aloud. Then he would say, well, Anatoly, why should we get stuck on this? Why don't we do it in a different way?
Face to face across the table, the two sides made progress on ABMs, but they barely touched on the most destabilizing of the new technologies, multiple warheads, MIRVs.
The subject was not really discussed, because by then the Americans already had this technology, and Russia didn't. We believed that we should have it too.
Finally, in May 1972, after almost 3 years of negotiations, President Nixon arrived in Moscow to sign the SALT agreements with Premier Brezhnev. ABMs had now been discredited, and the two sides agreed to limit them. But all they could agree on offensive weapons was a temporary freeze on missile launchers. The superpowers were learning to cooperate. Yet their failure to control MIRVs meant that in the next decade, Russia and America would add 12,000 nuclear warheads to their arsenals. Preparations for global annihilation continued.